There are all those present physically, and hi to all those present digitally, and apologies to those present physically for hearing me repeating this. It's a great honor for me to be able to chair this roundtable as part of the Bergen Exchanges by the Center on Law and Social Transformation. So I would like to extend my thanks to the Center on Law and Social Transformation and also to Bergen Global, who makes this possible. The roundtable that we've assembled here today represents a diversity of perspectives on a broad field, namely the relations between urban inequality, however we may understand that, and I hope we may understand something more about that later on, and what is often called securitization. While what we think of as securitization for decades has been integral to how cities are structured, this has become even more pressing at the current moment when the ongoing virus pandemic arguably transforms all aspects of human life. It has also, however, deeply impacted the multiple inequalities that are weaved into the texture of urban spaces and transform these, often through what one could label securitization. This includes, for instance, intensified surveillance practices, cameras, cell phones, heat detectors, to the introduction of state practices such as curfew and urban zoning, that one would, in a pre-pandemic era, have deemed draconian or at least deeply problematic from a human rights or political perspective. And this has been touched upon in earlier panels here as well. And it also includes questions that relate to the future of cities in a context with perhaps more specialized global mobility. Universal mobility may not even be formally a right everyone has anymore, just to name two kind of dimensions. So this roundtable will critically engage these and many other questions and thereby probe the relations between multiple forms of urban inequalities and securitization brought on by the pandemic. And with me today, I'm not alone. I have three experts with me here on stage, and there is one actually with us on Zoom, Antonella Di Trani, who came on Saturday and perfectly exemplifies the kind of laws and quarantining laws that we have now. She came from France, and France had then turned from one category in the Norwegian system to another, from yellow or green to red. So she's now in quarantine, awaiting her COVID-19 test, sitting 200 meters from here, but with us on Zoom. Yeah, so she exemplifies these kind of parodic but also deeply serious politics. So I will not speak for much longer, at least not now. I think we should do a round of presentations with the experts we have with us today and their perspective. And I'll start on my left. On my left here, your right, my left, this is always very confusing. I have Tereza Østbø Kuldova. She's a social anthropologist at the Work Research Institute at the Oslo Metropolitan University, and she's written extensively on topics ranging from, and please pay attention, populism, organized crime, nationalism, philanthrocapitalism, legitimacy, sovereignty, fashion, design, aesthetics, branding, intellectual property rights, India, and, very intriguingly, outlaw motorcycle clubs. And she's currently working on the topics of algorithmic governance, surveillance, and artificial intelligence in policing and the welfare state. Hardly topics that should be overlooked when we discuss these issues. So, Tereza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bjørn. Thank you for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here physically after so many online events. So I think we've been talking a lot about inequality and law, and especially the state and the government and their actions. But I think we also have to look at how law and the governmental actions interact with capital and with private corporations, and we see that those who are benefiting the most in the current crisis are the big digital companies, be it Amazon or Facebook, Google, Apple, Alphabet, and so on. And those are delivering all kinds of solutions, also Palantir, private security, and so on. And of course, we see together we have been seeing prior to this, and I think you can go back to 9/11 and the way crisis operates. So after 9/11, we have seen, well, the problem was the lack of data and that we didn't share data. If we would have shared data, we would have solved this, we would have stopped these terrorists. So this was a perfect reason to introduce more datification, more data sharing, and so on. And of course, we have seen enormous security measures put in place because of that terrorist attack. And now we're seeing another wave, let's say, of securitization as a consequence of this COVID-19 crisis. And I think that you have to look at the two biggest markets in data-driven area have always been, of course, securitization on one hand and health data. Now, health data have been notoriously difficult for these data companies to access. So they have been going to Africa or India to collect data, right? If you talk, I was at a talk by Microsoft, organized by Microsoft in Oslo prior to the COVID crisis, and they were saying, oh, it's extremely difficult to collect this data in Norway and in Europe because of GDPR and so on. But now they have the wonderful opportunity to collect this kind of data. So you can say in Germany there is a company that has already enlisted voluntarily people submitting data from their Fitbit, sleep data, all these kind of heart rate patterns and so on. And of course, these data are enormously valuable. If you consider, as people have been saying, data is the new oil and it's become almost a trope, there is enormous money in this market. And of course, what I found very fascinating with this kind of COVID crisis was that prior to this, we've always been looking badly at China. Oh, China is the bad, look at the authoritarians, they have this social credit system. It was almost bizarre, right? Ranking people, rating their trustworthiness, their compliance with all kinds of measures, preventing them from getting a train ticket or a flight ticket based on their rating and so on. And this was all horrible. But after this, even Norway has started looking to China. Look at the Chinese model. This was the first response after it has worked so well at containing this crisis. So we need all these digital tools. And of course, we have introduced a range of apps which were more or less successful or not. The Norwegian app has been trashed meanwhile. But what is really interesting that even though the app was trashed, what is the result of this? Before this kind of crisis, Norway has been talking about digital sovereignty and maybe we should control the flow of data. There has been this case with Palantir got contract for the Norwegian border control and so on. So what is this American company doing with the Norwegian police and so on? And these kind of institutions. But suddenly, this kind of failure of the Smittestopp has also proven that, the Norway is not really good at managing this so quickly. So we should give it to Apple and Google and rely on their solutions because they are much better in protecting privacy, right? So all of a sudden, you have a perfect argument for saying that Google and Apple are better in protecting private rights to privacy and so on, which is very paradoxical since you have had the ages of the opposite argument, I would say. And of course, in many countries, these apps have been voluntary and so on, but in many countries they haven't. And even the closest example is probably Poland, which is, for those in quarantine, the app is mandatory. You have to upload after 20 minutes that you're prompted, you have to upload your selfie. So the government is constantly kind of controlling and monitoring you that is correlated with location data and so on. And of course, this creates a colleague of mine, Alexandra Bartoszka, she wrote a fantastic article on that, and she's Polish, so she looked at how people respond to this and immediately triggered a lot of mental anxiety. And of course, this app really governs your life. It tells you when you're allowed to sleep. So you have 8 hours to sleep, but between certain periods, but then you have to report and you get a prompt to receive, to upload your selfie. And then if you don't do it, then you have a policeman knocking on your door for breaking the quarantine. And of course, the app was bugged so many times. So of course, you were not even able to upload whenever you were prompted and so on. And the government was even saying that, okay, if you don't have a smartphone, we just lend you one. That's not a problem. So you can't escape this kind of governance. Now, and we see that, of course, this kind of algorithmic governance is spreading, or has been already in many areas of our lives. You use it for if you're evaluated by a bank, so if you're credit worthy or not, this is largely done by an algorithm. Now, the funny thing is that, of course, the argument is we need to share this data. And if the problem, if the kind of systems fail, then it is the problem of we haven't had enough data. So if we have more data, it's going to work perfectly well. But the really interesting thing is that we are to be transparent to the government, to the corporation, and so on. But the algorithms are completely opaque and often very often proprietary. So if you ask the bank, why was my loan refused, they say, well, this is the algorithm that we have trained on the data that we have. I was talking to a person from DNB, and they confirmed that there is no way to trace back because it's a self-learning machine learning algorithm. You can't trace back to identify the reason as to why you have been refused the loan. And you might try another bank and it has a different algorithm, and you will succeed there. So those actions are totally opaque and a kind of evade transparency, right? And what is really interesting in this system is that suddenly we see this rise of data-driven governance. I mean, this has been there for a while, but I think has been intensified. So you rely on experts, but you rely even more on data. And we're told the data from an anthropological perspective, this is really interesting, are of course beautiful, they are pure, they are rational, they're objective. So as if technology is neutral, but we know that technology is not neutral. Algorithmic studies have shown time and again that all these softwares, predictive policing softwares, you use the same algorithms in targeted, in the signature strikes when you went away from targeted strikes. So you might as well be a victim of an algorithm these days. And of course, we are told that they are also pure. And this is really interesting, this desire for purity in a system that is polluted by the very same data. So you create a system where fake news and deepfakes proliferate, but then you want something that is hard. And I find very interesting that every time these companies promote their data, they say this hard is also very masculine, of course. and that also seems to be exaggerating this thinking that they are rational and so on. So, but of course, we know that they are not. And they rather reinforce existing inequalities. If you look at predictive policing systems in the US, for instance, then they of course build on previous inequalities, and they would create hotspot areas that are of course black and other minority, let's say, neighborhoods and so on, and kind of create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you have an inequality already built into the system. The data are not pure in any sense, and yet we are really kind of wanting to believe that they are. That there is the truth in the number. And this kind of logic of quantification, I think when you look at larger modes of governance that we are seeing today, this kind of technocratic post-political governance, it goes together with new public management, quantification, ranking, this kind of obsession to sort people, to classify people, to rank people. And when you create a kind of image of the world where everybody is a potential threat and everybody gets assigned a risk score, then I think it creates a kind of a dystopian world and of course, when the algorithm is to prevent you from entering a country, a space, you get a code red, I'm sorry, Bjørn, you can't come to this event. I mean, it is a very disturbing form of a world. And also because, we are also always told by these companies like, oh, everything is personalized, everything is customized to your person, but it is really not. I mean, it is really based on data that is kind of a proxy. So I categorize you together with people like you. So if a person like you didn't pay their bill and you live in the same area, you are to be punished for that as well, for instance, right? So this is, I think, something we need to think about. And I think for a final point, I think we have to also look at it as a kind of not only ideology of kind of scientific management and kind of digital Taylorism or so and so on, but also really an ideology of purity. And think of also the kind of metaphors that software is always using. Like the LAPD had this laser that was actually abandoned by the civil pressed by civil rights groups, but they replaced it with another predictive policing software, of course. But the laser, when you read the promotion for that technology, it basically says, well, it's called laser because we really want to surgically remove the kind of diseased part of the social body. Now, what kind of rhetoric does it remind you of? I mean, it is an absolutely fascist, deeply fascist way of thinking, where you think that you can just surgically remove this part of this social disease. And when you think that Airbnb, for instance, has patented this technology where they can rate indeed and rank the guests, and a part of that is to rank their trustworthiness based on scraping social data and from social media, and again all kinds of activities. You engage in sex work, do you have a criminal record, but also does your social media suggest a narcissistic profile? Then you must be something that is socially undesirable, and you try to eliminate it and remove access to certain goods. Now you can say with this within private company, they can do maybe whatever they want, but what kind of society does it create as a consequence? So that's...
Thanks a lot. That was incredibly many points for us to continue on, and I will not try to summarize, but I mean, you've given us an insight into a rise of potentially new political subjects and how they are created. You've given us a glimpse into how the COVID-19 also acts as not necessarily a smokescreen, but a Trojan horse in order to establish forms of algorithmic governance that are really quite deeply disturbing, both from a legal and a political perspective. Yes, this is, and you've shown us how this has impacts on urban inequalities in a sense, yeah, how it impacts different parts of the city. So I'm very disturbed, and I will not try to make this into a sort of a positive roundtable, a critical one. I think we should move on to, not to my right, but to my immediate front here. We have with us on Zoom the person I alluded to, Antonella Di Trani, who's in quarantine 200 meters away from here. Antonella Di Trani is an anthropologist and has a background from École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And currently she's a lecturer in social anthropology for architecture at the Superior National School of Architecture of Paris, Val de Seine. And in her work, Antonella has done extensive research on Venice, focusing especially on the city, on heritage, and inequality in urban space. And I can also add that Antonella will be able to come out of her quarantine, and she will be here a month as a guest researcher at UIB. So there will be opportunities to also engage her in physical format meetings. So I think we all look forward to that. But Antonella, the floor or the microphone and camera is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Bjørn, and good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank Bjørn for giving me the opportunity to participate to the Bergen Exchanges and to take part to this roundtable and discussion. Thank you so much. So in my presentation, I will approach the question around urban inequality and securitization by focusing on the uses of the city. So it might be slightly different than the previous presentation, focusing on the uses of the cities and practices in public spaces, implying also maybe a smaller scale. So the aim of this approach is to understand how the state practices and the different visible devices or dispositive, what we call a dispositive in the city, affect the inhabitants' mode of appropriation of urban space. I will talk about a few examples in France and maybe also in Paris. So first of all, with the pandemic, we can notice that the securitization in some cities implies a tangible transformation of the public space. It might sound obvious, but it's important to underline it, this transformation of the public space with installation of markings, of separating roads, of gates that create new boundaries and new limits inside of the city. It is what I call the temporary fragmentation of the city. And we see that the inhabitants have to deal with this security constraints, with this compulsion. And beside this, they put in place in the public space mutual avoidance tactic by creating new itineraries in the city. I'm talking about avoidance tactics. I'm taking this notion from Bernard Le Petit, that has he has worked a lot on strategies and tactics inside the city. This leads us to a more general question about how do we share the city and the public spaces in this context of pandemics, and in this context of tension and also suspicion of one from each other in the public spaces. So it's another vision of the public space under tension. We can also consider in a more general way that the relation of the inhabitants with the public space, and that's what I have been studying with my students at the School of Architecture, this relation with the public space depends a lot with the area they're living in, and the residence place. And also at a smaller scale, it has a link with the configuration of the private space. For example, it is more difficult to apply social distancing or to be confined, as we've been in France for 2 months, in poor areas, in social housing districts, in tiny spaces, especially for large families. I did some little observations in a district in the 18th arrondissement in Paris, and I could see this these practices. So this difficulty of to apply social distancing in this tiny spaces lead the inhabitants to go more outside and to go more also in the public spaces. That means that they're more exposed, not only in general to the pandemics, but also to the police checks. And actually we can, I could see that even if I was doing only my going to the supermarket, that the presence of the police was always bigger from one day to another because of this phenomenon. Right? So we can consider that there is a kind of double inequality. The first is determined by the place where the people live, and the fact that there is a vulnerability that is that comes with the place of the residence. So a double inequality. I repeat, linked to the place of residence, the people where the people live, the fact that they have to go they are lead to go more outside in the public space, and that they're more exposed, and so they're more vulnerable. So why am I talking about this? These examples, because this example in particular, because it's we have noticed, especially in Paris, that the wealthy classes, and maybe in Norway, I don't know if it's in Norway you had the same phenomena, but the wealthy classes in Paris are not confronted to this kind of inequality because they have the opportunity to confine themselves in a holiday home or in the countryside. So this inequality is really linked. I mean, the inequality problem is linked also with the classes and the places you live, or the inhabitants live. The previous person talked about the data. I just would like to say a few words about the surveillance practices or the devices that's positive, to take the Giorgio Agamben expression that we can talk about it. It's a very complicated notion that has been used in France. I'm not a specialist of that, but I can say a few words about it. For instance, there has been some uses of drones above city, French cities like Nice and Marseille, and the sociologists like Antonio Casilli and Alain Chouraki have emphasized how these practices take place in a really unclear legal framework. There's something that is really not clear with this legal framework by using this kind of devices. And in fact, there has been some actions from some associations like the League of the Human Rights towards the administrative court to contest the uses of this drone, because they're also filming and having a look on the private spaces. So there has been also the same actions about the uses of drone in above Paris, and they're not allowed, the police is not allowed to do it. So the State Council has prevented the use of the drone above Paris. And just another aspect, because we were talking about the data, Cassili also mentioned the problem that is linked to the personal data with the use of the mobile apps to prevent COVID. And I just wanted to underline, for instance, that in France, there's also an app, a mobile app that is currently used at the moment. It's called Stop COVID. And maybe as the other apps, it's not mandatory. It's voluntary, but it's not because it's voluntary that it doesn't lead to inequalities. Who will have access to these apps? Can everybody have access to these apps or not? And how do people deal with the social norm that tells us to have these apps? And is there a risk of appear like an outsiders if we don't do it? So there is a social pressure on how we will use these apps and how it will interfere with the more general way, interfere with the social norm and the mandatory character. So I hope this can lead to a few questions, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Antonella. I'm sure we'll come back to these questions. And you also raised a number of issues. One is the link between urban inequalities and what one could call possibilities for mobility, as you identified in terms of a class analysis, and the impossibility of movement or confinement, yeah, which is also related to class. Another issue that you raised is probably the which was perhaps pointing towards a hopeful future, the temporary fragmentation of the city. And I hope we can cling on to the temporariness of the fragmentation of the city. But this is also something we might want to discuss later on, if this is a temporary transformation that we're seeing now, or if it's the continuation of long-term politics, or if this is the installment of a new urban order in a sense. Yeah. Very good. I think we move on with the introductions. To my right here, I have Randi Gressgård, who's a professor at the Center for Women's and Gender Research here in Bergen. And she's also affiliated with the International Migration and Ethnic Relations Unit, also here. And Randi has worked cross-disciplinarily for a number of years, and her fields of interest span migration and minority studies, gender and sexuality studies, urban studies, and critical theory. And she has also undertaken multiple fieldworks, for instance, in Malmö, Sweden. And lately, you've been also involved, I know, because I've read your stuff, and it's very good. You've been involved in research on resilience and the transformation of urban societies. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I think it's on, but it doesn't sound like it's on. Is it on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. I have prepared a longer version, but I think I'll stick to quite a short introduction, because some of the things I had prepared have already been mentioned. So, I'd like to start with Susan Sontag, because in her essays on illness and metaphors, from the 70s and 80s. She describes, especially the essay on AIDS and its metaphors. She describes the situation that is quite similar to what we're facing now in the context of the coronavirus. And as she observed in her essays on illness and metaphors, there's a tendency to make dreaded disease foreign. She writes, demands are made to subject people to tests, to isolate the ill and those suspected of being ill or of transmitting illness, and to erect barriers against the real or imaginary contamination of foreigners. So the virus is indeed an equal opportunity destroyer, she writes, not only afflicting foreigners, but also minorities within, ethnic and racial as well as sexual minorities, even as token appeals are made for mass mobilization and solidarity. The latter serves to maintain an ideal of unifying communal practice, but as Sontag notes, when the survival of the nation or the world itself is said to be at stake, these claims are familiar parts of building a case for repression. As we know, declared emergencies or even non-declared emergencies require and justify drastic measures. And we have already been touching on surveillance techniques, various forms of urban surveillance, high-tech and physical, and also various forms of policing. So I won't go into those topics, but I would just quickly jump to my main point, which is related to what Bjørn said about resilience, because I think of course, it's extremely important to focus on these coercive techniques of governing and control, but it's also important, I think, that we do not exclusively focus on exceptional emergency rules and surveillance techniques, because we should equally be concerned with new possibilities for empowering so-called vulnerable populations as means to responsibilize marginalized people, but also to cover over endemic inequalities and institutional racism, homophobia and sexism. So to put this in academic terms, we should be attentive to the blurring of boundaries between the eventual or the urgent emergency, understanding of emergency, and the endemic, that which endures. As I have argued elsewhere, when urban security politics operates within the benign frame of resilience governance aimed at empowerment or capacity building, it involves distinctly different configurations of death politics or necro politics than coercive, often militarized techniques of control. So distinctly non-exceptional or non-eventful configurations of racial and other forms of death politics targeting so-called vulnerable populations require a critical vocabulary outside the traditional framework of securitization. And that is my main point here, because the term securitization tends to be associated with friends, enemies, distinctions, inside, outside, those kind of topographical boundaries that we are used to thinking along when problematizing control techniques. So my theoretical point is then that necropolitics or various forms of death politics sometimes operate entirely outside the trope of emergency as exception, which is to say without fabrication of explicit or named orders. So that politics of seemingly benevolent capacity building or empowerment, urban empowerment, could be better understood as a form of slow death, I argue, in a zone of ordinariness. And to cite Lauren Balland on slow death, this is a zone where life building and attrition of human life are indistinguishable. So, yeah, it's not that I'm arguing that we shouldn't pay attention to militarized policing and so on, but we should also be attentive to these seemingly benign forms of not control, but still a kind of racialization of whole urban subpopulations.
Thanks a lot. And this brings us away from focusing on the obvious, the militarization on the streets, onto seeing what types of policies are administered and installed in vulnerable populations. I think that is very important.
The very construction of vulnerable populations.
Yes, the very construction of vulnerable population, and the kinds of technologies, ideational and otherwise, these are exposed to. And you mentioned responsibilization as a particular technique that is pretty difficult to get your head around, because it's coated in the language of help, of aid, of self-help, etc., etc. All right, we move on to our last presenter before we enter into discussion, Atreyee. She is associate professor in anthropology in the Department of Copenhagen, and has actually come from abroad successfully to this roundtable. This is very good. This is the good news of the day. Her main research areas on gender and urban poverty in South Asia. Atreyee has undertaken several long-term fieldworks in slum areas in Mumbai and other Indian cities, and has worked on issues such as vigilante justice, and actually kids and youth also being engaged in vigilante justice. And I heard her many years ago, and I really enjoyed it. She's also worked on sexual violence, notions of urban safety, informal politics, and gender. So,
okay, great, thanks. Am I on? Great. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pick up on a strand of urban inequality, which I've historically worked on, which is on rape and sexual violence. And I'm going to talk about the informal responses of women's gender justice groups, which are not within mainstream societies. And I'm going to talk about its impact on poor women in urban India. So I'm going to give you a couple of case studies just to show you, how it actually works out on the ground. Something that Matthew and Malcolm touched upon in their papers was this question of femicide, rise in domestic violence, because globally, in the context of the lockdown, women have been trapped in homes with abusive partners. And when I talk about domestic violence and domestic abuse, I'm talking about it very broadly, from psychological torture to marital rape to violence, and also sexual abuse of children. So, it's like this discourse which has been created about, stay home, stay safe, and it's also been directed towards cities, imagination that the cities are the congested areas. So it's in cities that it's absolutely imperative that women stay at home with their partners. It's completely a counter discourse for women who have been trapped in violent marriages for a really long period of time. It's interesting to hear about this question of, Paris and public space, because when the lockdown was instituted in Europe, Paris had a 36% rise in domestic violence in 1 week. And it was something that got the attention of the media, because the women went on social media to display their scars, because that was the only way in which they could actually bring this to attention. And there was a lot of, it was interesting for me to see that the reaction to it was one of real shock of horror, which was that, this idea that white Parisian women could be getting beaten up by their husbands, and also sort of, coming into the public and talking about it, was not something that was part of the public imagination. Even though, women in Manchester and London, for example, got killed during the lockdown, there was this idea, it's a particular racialization of sexual violence, that, oh, it was happening in immigrant families. So it was like, the blacks and the browns who are getting killed. But when white women when they are hurt, there's quite a lot of shock and outrage against it. The United Nations General Secretary, for example, he came forward and he talked about the fact that we are dealing with something which is called a shadow pandemic. He said that now what the lockdown has created is that it's taken the battlefield away from other kinds of conflicts into the home. So now domestic violence is the new battlefield, and he appealed for peace at home because of the exponential rise in domestic violence all over the world. Now, in the context of India, for example, when the Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the 24th of March declared extreme lockdown, which is that it was, he absolutely shut down all public spaces, and he absolutely shut down the economy. Again, within 1 week, there was a 50% rise in domestic violence. So the National Commission of Women, for example, it came forward and it developed all these WhatsApp numbers and various other kinds of helplines, simply because all the women's NGOs, the police protection units, the child patrol units, all these resources had to be diverted towards maintaining lockdown, which is that how to chase people off the streets. All these resources were diverted. So there were no resources which were there to help these women. So, one of the interesting things that happened in the context of this corona was that eventually these informal gender justice groups, which existed in various slum areas historically, have they've created their care and affective networks. They still remain the first port of call, because anything that happened in the domestic within the context of domesticity, which was violent, women would have to call their neighbors, their teachers, other kinds of political leaders who were living locally to come and help you. Now, what was interesting for me to look at in this context was the fact that how do you actually help a woman who has been beaten up and she's probably bleeding without touching her, or without lifting her off the floor and putting her in an ambulance? How do you actually help a woman like that? So what a lot of the data which I collected in the context of the pandemic was about how to rescue women from domestic violence in urban spaces in the context of a pandemic, how to do it while maintaining social distance. So I'm going to give you just an example. It's a little funny, but it's not taking away from the seriousness of domestic violence at all. So Mumbai, where I did my research for 20 years in a slum, it is 650,000 people live in 2.5 square kilometers. So everybody has like a house which is the size of the stage, and there are 10 people living in these areas. In this context, when there is a case of domestic violence, usually marital rape, you can actually hear that woman screaming because the houses are so cramped and kind of stuck together. Now, none of these women are facing domestic violence for the first time. They have been trapped in bad marriages, in difficult relationships for a long period of time, but they always had an escape. Like either the man who was beating them up came home really drunk, and then you could just lock him up in a room and leave and go out and go and live with your parents for a while. Or you had work yourself, so you could go out and just sort of go off, and whether you were a street vendor or a maid or a cook and a cleaner, you could leave the house. You could take your children with you. If the man was employed, as an informal worker in the city, you could kick him out of the house. You had some power to kick him out of the house and say, go and earn some money for your family. But all these resources are gone. All these informal resources are gone. So these women are, with their children, trapped in these little hovels. So when you actually scream, then what kind of responses can you expect? Because the police are not around anymore. The child patrol units are not around anymore. So just to tell you a story is that Mumbai has had a very strong law on noise pollution. So especially in the evening, for example, you couldn't play loudspeakers, you couldn't make any noise. It's very, very strong on noise pollution. The women's network, the informal women's networks that exist in this particular slum that I work with, they came up with a strategy is that every time that the woman screamed, all of them would run out and maintain social distancing, stand quite far away from each other, and bang a lot of pots and pans. Or they would clap and then they would bang a lot of pots and pans, standing outside the home of the woman who was screaming. Now, for the man, it's very difficult to hurt a woman when there's so much of cacophony outside. So, like, you know, and then he is totally frightened of the fact that there are 2,000 women standing outside banging pots and pans. So if you are hurting a woman at night and, you know, and suddenly all these, like, you know, this group of women come outside and create all this noise, then you will kind of, you know, the process of beating up your wife gets interrupted. But this is interesting in terms of law because this noise pollution law has been suspended because you are beating pots and pans and clapping for health workers all everywhere in the world. So this was one thing that they had in their favor, and they used it to stop domestic violence. So this was a very interesting case for me. So what I want to end on this note is by saying that I have, like, you know, I collected various other kinds of examples where women would just, like, you know, talk to other women from a distance and help them up, and also sort of, you know, how women helped other women who were getting beaten up to turn up at these fever camps which have been set up. So usually most of these slum areas, they don't have mobile clinics. They've never had mobile clinics. They haven't had doctors, like, you know, swarming all over the place. But because of COVID, they do. So, but if, you know, they access the doctors by saying, okay, I'm here, I got beaten up, I don't have COVID, help me out. And ethically, the doctors find it really hard to say, okay, if you don't have COVID, you're bleeding from the head, you have to go. So they have to offer some kind of a treatment. So various ways in which these women are finding ways in which to deal with this surge in domestic violence. So what I want to give emphasis on is this idea of improvisation, is that here we have a case of a particular kind of urban inequality, which is related to domestic violence and sexual violence, which is exponentially exacerbated in the context of COVID. But you do have these kind of affective networks, and they were pre-existing, and I'm much more interested to see what are the ways in which we can empower these affective networks in the absence of legal resources that these women have access to. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you very much, and a very powerful example, this noise pollution example, and I can see it, you know, all the women outside with the pots and pans, and a fantastic example also of pacific resistance to heinous acts. So very powerful. You also pointed to something that I have not thought about too much, and we should all think about a bit. You probably all have thought about it, but I have not. This is the emergent or hegemonic cosmologies of safety, in a sense, yeah, that are in operation now during the COVID-19 pandemic, because there are new cosmologies in operation. What are safe spaces? Yeah, and some of these safe spaces may, as you say, intensify or replicate spaces that are incredibly unsafe and destructive from those that have to inhabit or be confined to those spaces, but from a state-centric point of view are very convenient to label as safe spaces. Yeah, so I think this is something we need to do a critical thinking of what safety, how safety is reconfigured. All your interventions, I think, are somewhere between the current moment of securitization being a moment where previous practices of securitization are continued or intensified, or there are moments of rupture. Yeah? Is this a moment of rupture or continuation or intensification? So I wonder if we could start by having a round on that. How do you see it? Is it both? I mean, that would be the easy answer. Or are we seeing something qualitatively new in terms of securitization? Do we see the rise, for instance, of new forms of statehood? Do we see the rise of new forms of citizenship? What do we see on the horizon? I invite you to speculate. Anyone want to speculate?
If you insist.
I insist.
No, I think it's largely a continuation, but an intensification, right, of pre-existing. I mean, all the securitization of health has been there previously. Securitization, surveillance has been there, but I think this has offered an opportunity to extend those systems into areas which we would not have been previously comfortable with to such a degree. And I think what is interesting is, of course, how it impacts privacy, all kinds of human rights, free speech. We see that, the criminalization of untruth or false news. And again, the question is who decides. And in South Africa, there is a new law on criminalization of untruth. I think this I think has to be really considered, this hunger for the one truth. Yeah. I mean, it's even very dystopic when you read the British government has used the Palantir, the security data provider to combine a COVID-19 data analysis. And on the government website, you can read that what they aim to, and I quote, is to enable disparate data to be integrated, cleaned, and harmonized in order to develop the single source of truth that will support decision making. Yeah? I think this is very interesting rhetoric when you think of a single source of truth, and when you have like so many decades of postmodernism and critical studies and so on, and you wipe that out and then you try to kind of impose the one source that comes from the government. And then, of course, it's very easy to say, well, if you don't agree with the governmental version of the truth, then we will either punish you or jail you. And of course, you can use it to suppress any kind of dissent and any kind of political dissent and other ways, suppress freedom of speech and so on. So I think this is a very crucial moment, not only for, there's been this debate about privacy and of course liberty, but also for freedom of speech. And of course, again, you see the same systems being used to sort through what is true and what is not if you use social media. So you would have those, like you have this botometer, for instance, that tries to determine if a Twitter is a bot or a real account. I ran it through, I was trying it out, and it turned out that my husband is a bot. So so I wouldn't trust it too much, but of course we are kind of hoping that it kind of generates some kind of truth, but even that system can't tell the difference, right? So this is, I think, deeply problematic because it's no longer even humans that are determining what is to be considered truth in the government, but it's also these kind of algorithmic systems that sort out and that basically don't have contextual understanding. If you say fuck in a certain context, it can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? but the kind of algorithmic system doesn't really know it and understand and the context. And I think this is interesting because you erase all kind of ambiguity or context. All kinds of acts of transgression are kind of not welcome. Now, these students that are drinking, I mean, this is horrendous, right? This is a simple act, but if they drink at home, then it's okay, or a private space. Then when it comes to this spatialization, I mean, when it is backed by capital, then it's okay to drink inside a pub, but it's not okay to drink outside where you have actually more space in between you. And it's even scientifically proven that you can do it more healthily. So this is, I think, interesting. Yeah.
Very good. Randi?
Yeah, I would like to pay attention to something slightly different, but related to your question about whether we see intensification or rupture of previously established practices. And I think I think my main impression is that if we see what happened in the context of racism and Black Lives Matter campaigning, I think that is something unprecedented because the COVID situation made it possible to pay more attention to systemic racism than ever before. And I think that might be, because there were not so much entertainment or other things to be occupied by. But anyway, I think that is the scale of the Black Lives Matter protest, I think is striking in itself, but also what I observed, I haven't studied this systematically, but it seems to me that unlike previous campaigning, this one has I think successfully paid attention to both the eventful fatal policing connected to actual deaths by American police, but also to the systemic or the endemic dimension of institutional or systemic racism. And what's interesting is to see how they have made, and I think this is a strategy they have deliberately used all over, is how they have made the endemic into an emergent crisis or emergency. So they have framed the endemic in terms of emergency, something urgent that has to be handled. Action is needed, and we can't wait. So it's interesting to, I think it's extremely interesting to see how this is part of a new kind of activism, and a very important message behind that is that there is no normal to return to. So yeah, that's my.
Very good. Yeah. So we have one vote for intensification, one for perhaps rupture in some fields. Very good. Atreyee?
Actually, can I talk about visibilization?
Yes,
instead?
You can.
So I do think that there are all these pre-existing social problems which have become far more visibilized in the context of COVID. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm actually voting in favor of continuity, but more morphed version of that. So I was just thinking in the context of what I was telling you about, a number of countries in the global south, for example, for the first time have incorporated feminist policymakers either in their cabinet or have as part of their advisory committee because of the rise in domestic violence. And this was something which is quite unprecedented, because earlier the assumption was that it was what Henrik Wieck calls a chronic crisis, is that it was just integral to the lives of the poor, that the women just got beaten up on a regular basis, and so there was no need for us to pay any attention to it. But the fact that there have been so many middle class and upper class women, and in the context of Europe, the fact that white male violence, for example, has come out to the fore in the context of COVID, that there has been a certain kind of visibilization of domestic violence, which was considered to be much more chronic and amongst the urban poor. And so this is something which I think is interesting in the context of COVID, is that in the sort of the churning of the social problems, for example, what actually swims to the surface.
Very interesting. But would you say then that in a post-COVID-19 moment that we all hope for, I'm not sure how it will look, but we all hope for it, will there be a return to the old normal, or is the old normal impossible, as Randi is saying? What's your position on that? I mean, for instance, in terms of domestic violence, will there be a new attentiveness and a new politics around that, or will there be sort of a slipping back into the kind of position we had, well, say in February 2020?
I think I wish I could talk about the rest of the world, but in the context of India, there will be a slipping back. I do not think that in a post-pandemic scenario, the attention which is paid right now to the rise in domestic violence has got a lot to do with the image that India has to the world. That if there is 150% rise in domestic violence, and then all these human rights organizations are on your case, then you need to sort of show that you have some policies, or you have some strategies in place. But I feel that in the post-pandemic world, there will be sort of much more resources which will be diverted towards economic reconstruction and providing jobs, and then towards looking at very specifically at gender interests.
Very good. Antonella, would you like to comment on this as well? You have to turn off on your microphone, I think.
Okay. I just wanted to add an example about violence towards women, for what has been said before. In Paris, for instance, we saw a rise of insecurity in public spaces, because during the day, normally women are very careful at night in Paris, but there was a feeling also of insecurity during the day, because during the lockdown we were allowed to do jogging in the neighborhood, and these women, me included, as for anecdote, we did it, for instance, very early in the morning, and I know that several women didn't dare anymore going in the public space because the city was totally empty. So if something would happen to us, nobody could intervene, nobody could rescue us, and so that was, I think, an implicit way to stay at home in another way and have this fear to go in public space again. So because you talked about Paris and public spaces, this is also a kind of insecurity that it gives a lot of pressure, the pressure to go in these public spaces. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I think actually that we should allow the audience, those that are here and those that are with us online, to intervene as well, because we have a half an hour more in this roundtable, which I'm very happy about, so that we actually have some time. So any questions, comments? Yes, I had Malcolm and then Thomas and... Oh, I repeat it, okay. So Malcolm, you can go first.
Okay. So on, I think it's a fantastic question, whether this very narrow focus on safety that we have now will have an outcome. And there is a parallel in which the September 11 attacks shaped our view of what human security has had in the last 20 years. And now we have that shaped and diverted massive funds, including the whole energy infrastructure. So we're talking about SDG. So I think it's, I'd really like to hear a bit more from the panel. So I guess I'm wonderful to hear about India and possibly your optimism. I have less optimism. The other question is on data. So I mean, I very much agree with the critique of now the government to play the devil's advocate. So one, is there a risk of reifying human discretion, particularly when it's built on bureaucratic so that, and secondly, isn't there also a role of visualization? So Black Lives Matter starts when citizens start videoing police behavior, surveying the press. So how do we get a vision of how the government takes that?
You've given me a very hard task of sort of repeating these questions, but your first question was about the afterlife of the kind of security measures or securitization measures being implemented in the current age, because we know it has an afterlife, as you pointed to, with the 9/11, yeah, that shaped our views of security and societal priorities, in a sense. Yeah. So will that also happen in this case? And I pose the question to the panel. Anyone want to venture?
Yeah,
Atreyee?
okay.
Not all panelists have to answer every question, I think.
Yeah. No, I do think this question of the afterlife of security is interesting, because in the context of my research, for example, I already work with people who are not protected very much by the law, and they mainly live in cordoned off areas where there is not much of a state intervention. They don't have access to a lot of resources which benefit other parts of the city, for example. But in this context, what has been interesting is that the COVID gave the state an excuse to withdraw even further from poor communities and vulnerabilities, which left them even more vulnerable in terms of having to come up with their own resources and their own responses to COVID. And I'm using sexual violence as one example, but even in other contexts, creating what could be alternatives to soap, and how to actually get access to water, just everyday basic amenities and resources. The poor are very much left to themselves. So I think that there are certain new ideas and new definitions of what constitutes human security, which is going to emerge in the context of which has emerged already in the context of the pandemic, but which will take on a new life after the pandemic. And it might have a social life, but I feel that what is interesting for me is that it will have also a discursive life after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You just there is someone showing your hand in the webinar.
Mm.
They have to write the question in the
Okay, just to intervene very quickly. If you want to post a question on the webinar, you have to write the question. You have to type the message, okay, in the Q&A. We can see the hand, but we can't see the question unless you type it in the webinar. I'm sorry, these are too many platforms at the same time for me. The second question Malcolm posed was on algorithmic governance and a tendency to, as I understood you, to in a critique of algorithmic governance to reify human discretion in a sense. Yeah. So do we fall into the other trap of thinking of abandoning the algorithmic in terms of I mean, do we fetishize the human and human intelligence?
Well, and I think the second question was this devil advocate's question, where Malcolm was asking about, holding the police accountable by making these videos and so on. I think I will try to briefly say what I think about it. But no, so of course you have biased, so-called dirty data, and there's this huge debate, right? And again, you see the same desire for purification in that debate. So if we have more data and more correct data and less biased data, then we will have a better product, obviously. But again, who defines what is the right resource, right? And of course, you can build in the dirty data creates this kind of loop where you have already biased results. So I mean, if you create a hotspot in a certain neighborhood and then you go on policing in the same neighborhood, you keep stopping these brown and black people that look suspicious for no apparent reason. They get another score in the system, and then again they show a higher risk, of course. So this kind of creates a self-reinforcing loop. And the policeman is also trapped within this kind of system, right? So if you look at how police operates these days, also in Norway, when you have this operational central that keeps sending people, you no longer have this community policing, but you have a police governed by this kind of really this kind of new public management, hitting targets, quantification. And of course, what they will focus on is that which is easy to quantify. So if what gives me points, and I think we see the same perverse incentives also in academia, you get more publishing points by publishing somewhere, so you're more likely to adjust your argument to fit in a particular journal, and then you're rewarded by a tenure or similar things. And of course, the police operates in similar ways. So, and these kind of police discretion, it kind of gets influenced by these algorithmic systems in practice, right? And it kind of reinforces. So you feed even more bias as a result into the system, possibly. So I think the relationship is far more complex if you want to nuance the argument. And you would have to look at how management systems and the organization of police work, for instance, is related to the introduction of these algorithmic systems. I mean, if you look at, for instance, this kind of predictive policing system, it comes together with another software that manages the police itself. So the police itself is managed by a similar system that it manages the streets, right? So you're kind of bound by several logics of this algorithmic management, which is not too simple even for the police. And of course, when they try to very often do their best according to their police discretion, and they are often also stopped by these systems from doing that because it doesn't count. You cannot go there without a permission and so on. So there is a complex system. And I think the second question which you raised, and I got this question several times already, like there are these people at the protests or somewhere, or they are filming the police, isn't that good? And of course it's good to have those tools, but the power dynamics is completely out of proportion. Our power to hold the system to account is so minimal when you have with your little camera on your little smartphone, as opposed to the power of both the security establishment, law enforcement, and these kind of corporations. How do you hold them accountable with your little camera? And I think the question again, and this question is the wrong question, I would say. I think what you should be asking is, do we even need these kind of technologies in certain areas of life? Like, for instance, do we need facial recognition at all? And of course, there are cities in the US that have banned the use of facial recognition. So I think this is a political question. And I think this kind of technocratic logic, what the system what this technology enables, what can it be good for, can it be used for bad, or can it be used for wrong? I think it's kind of question that eludes politics, or I would say politics proper, and it leads again into this argument about how to debias, how to create more privacy. But to be honest, I don't think there is much privacy left in our lives. Privacy is a luxury. If you look at today, you have to pay in order to be private on the internet. Like the organized crime gangs that have been blown up right recently in this by Europol. What did they have? They had extremely expensive kind of phones to communicate with each other, which were still kind of hacked, right? But they pay enormous amounts in order to remain private. And then again, I think this narrative also equates privacy with something to hide, right? Whereas on the other side, we don't have any kind of transparency. So yeah, I don't know. I would argue for more politics and less technocratic thinking.
Very good. I have now Randi with a comment, then I have Thomas with a question, and then I think we have someone online. Okay. Okay, very good. Randi first.
Yeah, just briefly on the citizen surveillance, and you mentioned Black Lives Matter, so related to that, and I think it's a pertinent question, and I think there was an opinion piece in The Guardian yesterday or the day before on this issue, and I think some of the argument was that kind of video surveillance and sharing should be unnecessary, but in the context of racism and systemic racism, that kind of visibility is important to white people. I mean, Black people know these things happen all the time, but this kind of visibility is perhaps the only way to go right now, even though it's ethically questionable to broadcast or to share these kind of videos where people die. And there's also the question of, why do we accept looking at Black people dying without a context, without a biography and so on, whereas white people would be portrayed in a completely different manner in equal circumstances. So I think there's no simple answer to your question, but but I think it is a pertinent question, and we should take it seriously.
Thanks. Thomas?
Yes.
I have to repeat the question. Yeah.
Is about the framework of securitization and whether or not it is a framework to think about the COVID pandemic at all, because I think that there are so many, like there are some things that fit, but there are other things that, to me at least, don't seem to fit properly within this framework, especially in terms of different governments' desire for expanding their control over the population, because I think in many cases what we've seen is a demand from the population for more government action rather than the opposite. And we've also seen the governments who have clear neoliberal agenda and a clear traditional authoritarian security politics who have been very cautious about implementing measures against the pandemic, and in other cases, people who have self-isolated or who have or communities that have policed themselves. So I wonder, like, if this securitization framework is suitable in these cases.
All right, just to repeat the question to the digital audience who are not able to hear this, Thomas asked whether securitization as a term, as a concept, as a tool to think with is appropriate given the variety in which governments have responded to the current crisis and the very differentiated politics they have implemented, in a sense. So in a sense, you're making an analogy. I'm interpreting you now. You're making an analogy between the fate of the old concept of, for instance, the neoliberalism, that was used by everyone for everything under the sun and within the universe as well, and that has been sort of depleted of meaning, some say. So you kind of make an analogy in that sense. Anyone want to take on this?
I'll just say something very, sorry. Yeah, okay. I'm going to say something very briefly. For me, safety and security are very different concepts. So I think what we are, for security is, for me, it's a much more long-term state of being, which is being free from threat and danger and risk. And safety is actually a condition of either feeling free from violence and also not being able to inflict violence on others. So so when we talk about, like, securitization, we are actually talking about something which is much more long term and much more deep. What is interesting in the context of COVID is that how the language has emphasized safety. If you look at, like, media and public debate, and in terms of, like, much more everyday gritty reality, the emphasis is very much on safety, but all the language of law and the state is about security. So anyway, it's just something that I wanted to throw in there, which I find quite interesting in terms of engaging with this idea of securitization.
We have Randi with a comment, and then we have Prem Kumar.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a few words on that.
Hello.
I think
actually, hi. My name is Prem Kumar. I'm from Manipur. It's from India. I just want to make a comment on what, particularly what Antonella talked about, and I think that we can also talk about this aspect of compliance here, like how people or certain sections expect one another. These particular sections of or groups expect one another to comply to the law. For example, here in my state, in Manipur, what happened was, like, the upper classes or those in the wealthy group, when the government announced a strict lockdown, like, they could stock of everything, like they could buy these grains or the essential items. They could stock of almost everything because they had connections and all. But the lower class, they could not stock of all those things. So, like, when the government shut down, they didn't have money to buy all those things. So they gave coming out repeatedly even after the lockdown was imposed. And they also have to earn their livelihood. They could not just, like, when the government says that there is a lockdown, you cannot come out, they cannot suddenly, like, have money to buy their essentials that they used to earn and buy on daily basis. Like, they were living, like, they were earning, like, and buying for every day, but they just could not, like, they cannot just sit down and have like stay inside the home. So they need to come out repeatedly. So, like, the most of the people in media portray this group of people as people who do not comply the law, those who are like violating laws. And in fact, the police personnel collect fines from those who come out of their homes, and actually like thousands of rupees were collected from these people, and every day it would be reported on daily newspapers that this amount of money has been collected from this particular district of the state, like that. And next is about the quarantine facilities. Like we have also started making this home quarantine system, like home quarantine system. And in home quarantine system in urban areas, it's expected that the COVID positive person should have a separate toilet, a separate like room, etc. That is not possible in like among the poor people. Like, so they do not have these things, so they have to stay in a quarantine facility set up by the government. But they do not want to go. They do not want to go to these quarantine facilities because these quarantine facilities are not properly operated. There are like no regular foods, and like doctors do not come there because of shortage of nurses, and all those things happen. So they do not want to go to quarantine center, but like somehow the police come and the police personnel come and they want to forcibly take them to quarantine center. So they run away from home before the police come, or whenever they know that the police is coming to home. So these things happen. So whose law is it anyway? Like sometimes people question whose law is it? Like the law says that like this shutdown, this lockdown is for you, like for your life. And but at the same time, people are fighting for their livelihood, especially this poor community. They're fighting for their livelihood, and they cannot even have access to safe drinking water during this time. Like forget about essential items. So I think like the way the society expects the poor class or the lower class to have like better compliance, etc. When they think like that, they are forgetting like, or they are not seeing a particular side totally. They're forgetting that. I think we could talk about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your question was directed towards Antonella first, but I think we can take your intervention as a cue to round up. So perhaps Antonella, you can respond, and then we can have Tereza, Randi, and Atreyee, because we're approaching 7 o'clock. So Antonella, do you want to comment first? You have to unmute.
Excuse me. So if I understood well, it was more a critic about how we can define poor areas and access to essential devices. Was that the question?
It was about compliance.
And compliance, yes. And law and class and a few different issues. Yeah. So you can reflect on your Paris work, for instance, in relation to that.
Yes, it's the question of port district is very heterogenic in Paris, and my observation, it's more on the meaning that people give to public space in regard of the possibilities that they have in private space. And yes, I'm thinking about this question. It's a very big question, and I think I don't have enough observations to have a better response about the Paris case.
That's fine, Antonella. Thank you. Tereza.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to Prem Kumar for a brilliant summing up of the situation in India, and I think many other places. Even here, we have the same issues in different neighborhoods, obviously. And And I think that obviously the whole concept of social distancing is a very classed concept. Who can afford it? Who can have the resources to distance? And you see it. Who can have home office? Who cannot have home office? And but I think it also points us to a kind of idea of who is the good citizen in the eyes of the state today, right? This is the one who has the resources to distance, who complies, who downloads a nice app, and of course also the one who calls the police on the neighbor who has a party late night. So I think, and if you are asking, you know, I think that also it's not only that the state wants certain citizens, but they also citizens very often want to be seen by the state. And you know, if you read all those comments in social media and so on, and people calling for more restrictions and so on, it's okay. They want to have a certain sovereign. The same way after 9/11, you know, there's a brilliant article on the kind of sovereign actions of the American government following 9/11. I think that there is a desire in the population for a certain sovereign. Now the question is, what kind of sovereign, and does it enslave you, or does it allow you to have your own sovereignty? And I think we're more or less headed to the more enslaved notion. But of course, people like to have an authority about them. And I think we have seen that historically in many examples that it can go very fast. That you lose liberties in the name of safety, security, health, and I think that, you know, and part of the problem is, of course, who can be against health, who can be against security, who can be all against these wonderful ideals. But I think that there is a danger that in the name of security, we sacrifice security itself. In the name of health, we sacrifice health. Like, is it violence at home? Is it mental health issues? Is it all kinds of operations that are postponed? What are the actual costs? We will probably never know. So I think, and of course, again, to return to this Indian case, what is the good citizen? Has an Aadhaar number and has an Arogya Setu app downloaded and behaves in certain ways. So, yeah.
Thanks, Randi.
Yeah, I think I would like to respond to Thomas as my concluding remark, because it fits with or it points back to my introductory remarks. Because my main problem with the framework of securitization is that it tends to be totalizing, and I think that's what you also gesture towards, that there is a certain programmatic way of defining security when you use that vocabulary. At least some traditions using securitization vocabulary I find quite totalizing, so I have a problem with that.
Atreyee?
Yeah, so I again, like, I just wanted to use like a current debate which is going on in the context of India to wrap up my comments, which is the fact that how cities have globally now become the source of COVID, and it's been considered to be filthy and unclean, and people in the cities are the ones who are always having parties and not following laws, and sort of, you know, urban residents are being demonized in the context of COVID. And then it's interesting in the context of India, because India had a full lockdown, so a lot of rural urban migrant workers had to go back to their homes to be quarantined, and they don't want to come back to the city, and they want urban dwellers, like, you know, especially upper class, middle class urban dwellers, to be accountable for their actions. And this has created a whole crisis, because, you know, this in the context of inequality, it's the fact that the people who are being non-compliant, something that Prem Kumar was talking about, are rich urban affluent classes, and they are not following quarantine rules, and they are, I mean, if you just go to Denmark, you just don't know whether there is a COVID going on, because if there is sunshine, everybody's out. And so it's a question of the fact that here I feel that when it comes to inequality, there's an interesting reversal of power relationships which is going on here, where villagers don't want to come back to the city to work because they are vulnerable in the city. They feel that, you know, cities are sites of infection and disease, and this is being reinforced by the fact that, you know, what you were talking about the fact that people are running away from the cities. In Denmark, everybody ran away to their summer houses. You know, Copenhagen was completely empty. And you also mentioned that historically people just ran away to the manors. So it was always about the city, like, you know, being the site of infection. But this is an interesting case in which the villagers, people living in their village, they want to revive the village economy. They don't want to go back to the city as migrant workers.
Thanks a lot. It is truly an impossible task to try to sum up the debates we've had here. They've gone in many, many directions, from the emergence of new forms of political subjectivities to the horizon of a post-political urban future where we will be digitized and under totalitarian kinds of regimes, to perhaps the opposite, where new collectives and new possibilities for the political is present. So the debates have to continue, but not here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.